Before we continue deeper into the Ashworth legacy and the sacred soil they turned into a marketplace of flesh, I want you to look around wherever you are listening from and ask yourself a question. How many stories in your town never made it into the books? How many graveyards are older than memory? How many churches have changed hands so often you cannot trace the first sermons spoken on their altars? The truth is, what we call history is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what was permitted to be remembered, and that distinction is everything, because once a truth is buried deep enough and long enough, it becomes dangerous when uncovered. Dangerous not because of what it proves, but because of what it implies. So if you have made it this far into the story of the Ashworth brothers, then you deserve to know this is not just history, this is forbidden's memory. The kind kept out of schoolrooms because it disrupts the illusion, the kind that rots beneath the floors of old courthouses and inside the walls of hospitals named after philanthropists who purchased their reputations with blood. If you're hearing this, I invite you to subscribe, not for me, but for the stories themselves, because someone must remember. What others were paid to forget, comment below and tell us what state you're in, because sometimes the land itself remembers. Even if the people don't, sometimes it whispers, sometimes it screams, and if we're lucky or unlucky, depending on who you ask, it answers. And now we go back not to a battlefield, or a parliament, or a war-torn city, but to something far quieter, and therefore more frightening, the wild pine woods of eastern Kentucky, where in 1784 three brothers set foot on soil they already intended to corrupt, not by conquest, but by communion. Ezekiel Morai and Zechariah Ashworth arrived with no fanfare, no flags, no banners. Just skill, charm, and timing. They came when the land was young, but the hunger in the cities was already old. They came with their trades and with their lies perfectly balanced and perfectly practiced. Ezekiel, the undertaker, spoke softly, moved, slowly, carried the weight of a man who had seen death and knew how to dress it. Morai, the grave digger, was quieter still, eyes dark like a cellar that had never seen light, fingers skilled from carpentry work that required precision and silence. And Zechariah, the preacher, wore smiles like robes, all white, and warmth and scripture, but behind his eyes there lived something older than God himself, and no one ever thought to ask where he trained or who ordained him. Because when you live 2 days' ride from the nearest court, the man with the Bible becomes the court. And in Ashworth Creek, where wolves still howled at night and women still bled to death in childbirth, you did not question the men who took care of the dead, because you would need them eventually. The cemetery was built on 5 acres of pine-cleared soil just east of the settlement. It was Zechariah who named it Death Valley, claiming it came from Scripture, Psalm 23, though he never quoted the verse exactly. And those who checked found the words were never quite there. The land sat on a slope soft enough for easy digging, dry enough to preserve bodies, but what no one knew, what the brothers never spoke aloud, was that it also sat just a quarter-mile from a trade path rarely used, but well connected, the perfect artery for moving things that should not be moved. The cemetery included a small chapel, whitewashed, simple, but always clean. Behind it stood the low building where Ezekiel prepared the dead, and beside that, Marai's coffin workshop. The graves were neat, the headstones carved with care, sometimes with Bible verses, sometimes just names and dates, but always with a reverence that made people trust, made them weep, made them speak about the Ashworths like they were God's own sons, sent to guide them through the valley of shadow. What no one knew, what no one even imagined, was that the coffins they buried were not coffins at all. Not in the way they believed. Yes, they were wood. Yes, they were heavy. Yes, they were sealed. And yes, there was always a face to see during the viewing, the body dressed and peaceful and covered to the shoulders. But what came after the family left? What happened when the room was silent again? When Ezekiel locked the door and pulled open the trapdoor beneath the embalming table, it was something no scripture ever Covered the cellar ran cold, even in summer, filled with salt barrels, sawdust crates, and iron hooks. Not for storage, but for process here Ezekiel would drain the bodies, inject them with his preservation mixture, a trade secret he claimed was part science, part providence here. Morai would prepare the shipping boxes disguised as tool crates lined with waxed linen, packed with soft pine and nailed shut, like any other supply load meant for a distant city. And here Zechariah would write the names in the false burial book, the one the town would see, while the real record was kept in Ezekiel's hand-bound ledger, where the entries were cleaner, more honest, and infinitely more damning. Sometimes the body was taken hours after death, sometimes minutes, and when the supply dwindled, they learned to wait by the roads, listening for wagon wheels, watching for men who traveled alone, who drank too much, who prayed too little, who would not be missed. The red crosses did not begin immediately. They were added only after Zechariah gave the blessing, only after the screens had stopped, and the crates were sealed, and the chapel was open for prayer, and every man and woman who sat in those pews had no idea that God himself had left the room long ago, and something else had taken his place, something colder, more patient, and infinitely more profitable. The Red Cross entries did not appear in the first ledger. They emerged, slowly, subtly, like mold behind the wall, or rot in a trusted floorboard at first. There were only 2 in the entire volume, both in the winter of 1785. The handwriting did not change, the ink did not darken, but something in the curve of the letters hinted at hesitation, the kind of hesitation that does not come from fear, but from crossing a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. Both entries described unnamed travelers. One, a man listed only as subject W, with a note that read solitary, injured, and without companions. The other, subject R, listed as mute, likely foreign, no known dialect, both marked with a red cross, both paid for in advance by Dr. J.T. at Philadelphia Surgical College, with special request for full musculoskeletal study and intact brain matter. The words were precise, clinical, as if the human within the body had already been erased by the time the ink touched paper, and from those 2 marks, the flood began. Over the next 3 years, red crosses began appearing with more frequency, sometimes once a month, sometimes 3 or 4 in a week. The notes beside them grew shorter. The names vanished, replaced by initials or physical descriptions or nothing at all. One entry in July of 1788 simply read, small frame, likely female, no resistance, $70. University of Baltimore, paid in coin, preferred Freshness Brothers, approved. No other comment, no remorse, no poetry, just a trade completed, and a name never spoken aloud. The community never questioned the sudden expansion of the cemetery, never wondered why so many fresh graves appeared each winter, or why the Ashworths had hired a 3rd man to help with transportation, a quiet driver named Harlan, who spoke only when spoken to and carried a knife under his vest, the kind used to bleed animals or open stubborn crates. By the spring of 1790, the operation had evolved from secret to seamless. The ledgers listed names, weights, destinations, amounts, and once or twice special notes that hinted at something even darker. One entry read, subject showed signs of waking during preparation. Zechariah administered solution, unable to determine consciousness at time of death. No family, no inquiry. Another read, eyes open throughout transit, covered with cloth upon arrival. Invoice confirmed, paid. Double silence maintained when confronted with the volume of this record. It is easy to imagine monsters, but that is the mistake we always make. The Ashworth brothers did not laugh while they worked. They did not dance. They did not rant or howl. They were calm, polite, measured. Zechariah continued to preach every Sunday, his voice a balm to the grieving, his sermons filled with resurrection and heavenly reward for the faithful. He touched hands with those whose husbands and sons were now salt-packed crates somewhere between Kentucky and New Haven, and they thanked him for it. They told him he was a blessing. They said they did not know how they would endure without him. And he said, I am merely a servant of the Lord, and bowed his head when Martha Tunney lost her daughter to a sudden fever in the winter of 1791, she brought her to the Ashworths, wrapped in linen, already cold with death. Ezekiel examined her eyes, noted the clarity of her skin, scribbled something in a small notebook, and told Martha the funeral would be held the next morning. He spoke gently when he explained that the coffin must be sealed early due to health concerns, and Martha nodded and said she understood, and she left that night. Zachariah wrote the child's name in the family ledger, placed a smooth white stone on her supposed grave, and wrote in the private volume, Subject 29, small female. Exceptional preservation condition, paid $33 to Dr. H. at Penn Medical Transit, secured by Harlan, no complications. Martha returned to the grave every Sunday for 5 years, and never once suspected that the soil beneath her feet held only air and sand, and that her child's body had been dissected and diagrammed in a room filled with students who had never known her name. The real horror is not in the crime itself, but in how cleanly it can be committed, how easily the human spirit can be manipulated with a kind word, a Bible verse, a polished coffin. The Ashworth brothers did not need to hide, because they were never suspected. They lived in plain sight. Because the darkness they represented was dressed in the robes of necessity, medical colleges wrote letters asking for more supplies, more variation, more delicacy. They sent formal requests for juvenile skeletons for comparative study of spinal curvature in adolescent females, for elderly males with bone deformation, and each time Ezekiel made a mark in the ledger. Morai crafted a box, and Zechariah gave a sermon, and the community grew more grateful, not less, more trusting. Not less, they were burying empty boxes and praising the men who sold their bloodline. Piece by piece, and when the red crosses became too numerous to mark individually, Ezekiel began writing only the number at the end of each week. Total received, total shipped, total awakened. Prematurely, and then the final line, always the same, coffin weighted appropriately, family none the wiser. And that was the sentence that made a man stop breathing when he read it in 1918, because that sentence meant every part of it had been deliberate. The word appropriately did not mean respectfully. It meant strategically. The word family did not mean people. It meant silence. And the word none the wiser was not a fact. It was a mission. And now, as you hear this perhaps for the first time, perhaps alone, you must ask yourself if your great-grandfather was buried with hands folded and eyes closed, or if he was sold to a laboratory where his skull was boiled clean and mounted for display. If your great-grandmother's grave was real or just a place you return to out of habit, not knowing that what you pray over is just pine and rock and the goak, name of God carved in a lie, because the Ashworth brothers were not the only ones, and the red crosses were not just theirs, and the silence that protected them still lives in the bones of this country, like marrow and like rot. And the next part of this story will tell you how the place called Ashworth Creek was not chosen by chance, and how it was never just a resting ground, but something older, something selected for reasons. The ledgers never fully explained, reasons that cannot be forgotten, even if they are never fully understood. The place they called Ashworth Creek was never a town in the way we understand towns. It had no mayor, no formal charter, no maps that survived the decades, except for one brittle page found in a preacher's Bible dated 1793, where a rough square of land was marked with the words Valley of Peace, written in Zechariah's own hand. But that name never caught on, perhaps because even then something deeper whispered through the trees and coiled in the roots beneath the soft black soil. It began, as most settlements did, with families fleeing something, hunger, war, taxation scandal. Those who moved west in the years after the Revolution were not seeking freedom so much as forgetting they brought their dead with them, but also their secrets. And when they arrived in the forests east of the Kentucky River, they saw a clearing. They could not explain trees that had grown in perfect circles, a stream that never froze, even in February, and a patch of land that was warm to the touch even when the air bit with frost, And so they built cabins, they planted crops, and they prayed, but always with an unease that settled just beneath the surface. Like a blister that never quite breaks, they said the birds did not sing in the grove where the cemetery would later be built, and when children wandered there, they often returned, mute for hours, staring wide-eyed at nothing and muttering about voices. Beneath the earth, but frontier life was harsh, and superstition was tolerated so long. As the crops grew and the wolves stayed away, and when the Ashworth brothers arrived in the spring of 1784, the people welcomed them not just with relief, but with a kind of reverence, as if some part of them had been waiting for someone to explain. The darkness they all felt, but never spoke aloud. Ezekiel was the oldest and the one who first stepped into the chapel during construction, placing his hand on the altar before it had even been consecrated, and saying quietly, "This ground is weighted." Long enough Morai was quiet and almost invisible, his face pale, and his hands always working as if still trying to shape something not yet fully seen. And Zechariah the youngest walked the woods, alone for hours each morning, returning with his boots clean and his voice low and dry. He said he was praying, but some of the children who followed him in secret claimed they heard him speaking in another tongue, one not taught in seminary or scripture, a language that sounded like wind and water, and bone breaking slowly beneath weight, not impact. When questioned, he laughed and said, "The Lord speaks many tongues. And who are we to limit his breath?" The chapel they built was small, but perfect white with a copper bell that never tarnished no matter the season, and a single stained glass window depicting the resurrection, though if you looked too closely at the face of the risen Christ, it seemed to change expression, depending on the angle, sometimes sorrowful, sometimes angry, sometimes entirely blank. They never explained where the glass had come from or how they transported it through the wilderness without a single crack, and no one dared to ask, because by then the funerals had already begun, and the sermons had already taken root, and the cemetery had already expanded beyond what seemed natural for such a small settlement. Too many graves, too, close together, with names that no one remembered, and stones that seemed to age faster than time itself. A traveler passing through in 1787 wrote in his journal that the air near the cemetery felt heavier, and the ground pulsed underfoot like a sleeping thing disturbed. And though he stayed only one night in Ashworth Creek, he left before dawn the next day and never returned. And the journal was found decades later in the attic of a house in Richmond, unopened until 1902, when his great-granddaughter read it aloud during a séance and fainted before finishing the page. Her hair turned white by morning, and she never spoke. Again, what made the land of Ashworth Creek so valuable to the brothers was not just its location, its isolation, or its convenience. It was something older, something they never wrote in the ledgers, but hinted at in their personal letters preserved by accident in the lining of Ezekiel's travel trunk, found in a barn in 1929 by a boy hunting rats. He never married and never spoke of what he found, but the letters eventually surfaced in a private collection sold anonymously to a university archive that refuses to digitize them, citing damage too severe for scanning. But those who have read them say they are not damaged. They are just written in parts of the Bible that never made it into the binding words attributed to prophets. No. One remembers names of angels whose wings were made not of feathers, but of sharpened bone and hollow stone. In one letter Ezekiel writes that the soil of Ashworth Creek is not merely soft for digging, but accepting, and in another Zechariah writes, "The land hungers as men do, and it must be fed, or it remembers, and if it remembers, it rises, and none of us will be safe." Not then, not ever. What did they mean by fed? Not just corpses, not just the bodies of the dead, but those who still held breath, who still dreamed, who still begged and screamed and clawed and prayed, and when they buried them in crates sent eastward with false names and forged causes, they believed they were harvesting not just for profit, but for purpose, because the land was not dead, it was waiting, and every body removed Every soul stolen was an offering not to science, but to something deeper. Beneath the forest floor, something that listened and waited and whispered in dreams. One man, a doctor from New Haven, visited the site in 1802, posing as a cousin of a recently deceased settler. In truth, he had come on instruction from the anatomical board to confirm the source of the bodies being received by his school. He stayed 3 nights and wrote only 1 sentence. In his notebook before vanishing entirely, the sentence read, "They do not bury the dead, they only relocate them," and his satchel was found years later floating in a creek 50 miles west, containing no clothes, no maps, only a single human tooth wrapped in linen and a receipt for a crate labeled agricultural tools, dated April 1802. Destination: Yale University, with the Ashworth brothers built in Ashworth, Crete, was not a cemetery. It was not a church. It was not a town. It was a system, a ritual, a feeding ground, and the longer it existed, the quieter the forest became, until no birds sang, no animals crossed the graves, and no child was born. Within a mile of the chapel, from 1797 to 1820. And that silence, that ache in the air, still lingers even now for those brave enough or cursed enough to find the forgotten trails and follow the rusted signs that still bear no names, only the symbols scratched into the back wall of the chapel long since collapsed, a spiral carved deep into the wood, a spiral of bone, a spiral of breath, a spiral that leads not to resurrection, but to something much older, something that waits, something that is still waiting even now. Ashworth Creek was never meant to thrive in the way other towns did. It did not grow toward light. It grew inward downward, fed not by commerce or kinship, but by something quieter, something that moved beneath foundations and whispered through root systems and frozen springs. By the time it reached 40 families in the winter of 1786, the place had already begun to fold in on itself in ways that maps could not track, and preachers could not name. The people stayed because they feared what would follow them if they left, and the men who arrived in search of land often left within a week, claiming the soil was sour, or the winds unnatural, or the shadows too long even at noon. But those who stayed learned not to speak of such things, because Zachariah Ashworth told them to, and when he told them to, they listened. He was not the sort of preacher who screamed damnation. He did not preach hellfire. He spoke instead of quiet judgment of the silence that follows disobedience, of the burden of knowing and the gift of forgetting. His sermons left people uneasy, but also cleansed, like they had tasted something bitter and been purged of it. He did not quote scripture. He recited it from memory, always the exact verse needed for the moment, always delivered with a voice so calm and steady it seemed to dull the pain in the room. Even children sat quietly when he spoke, as if their bones understood something their minds could not. And it was said that even animals kept still near the chapel, and when Zachariah laid a hand on the brow of a grieving mother or a wounded farmer, they swore the fever broke, or the bleeding slowed, or the nightmare stopped for a time. Anyway, Ezekiel was more practical. He built coffins, tended graves, spoke little, but always listened. He kept records not just of the dead, but of the living who visited, who wept, who touched the coffin last, who questioned too much, who stayed too long in the chapel after service. These notes were not kept in the town ledger, but in a smaller book bound in gray leather, always tucked beneath his coat, and never shown to anyone, not even Morai, who worked quietly and without rest, carving wood, sharpening tools, preparing the pine boxes that would never hold what they claimed to hold. His fingers were always stained with something dark, not quite sap, not quite blood, and he spoke to no one except his brothers and the dead, and even then only in whispers. The house they shared stood at the edge of the cemetery, separated from it by a line of pine trees that never lost their needles, even in the dead of winter. The house itself was strange, not in appearance, but in feeling. No one ever entered. except a boy once who ran in chasing a dog and came out an hour later with white hair and a gaze that never focused again. He died 6 months later of a wasting illness that no doctor could name, and his mother never forgave the land. The layout of the home was never drawn, but stories tell of a cellar deeper than the house was tall of floors that sloped slightly inward, as if the whole structure leaned toward the center point, not visible to the eye of rooms that changed size from one visit to the next of doors that opened onto blackness, so completed, made the air feel heavy and old and wrong. The brothers kept to themselves, but they were not reclusive. They walked the town, attended births, offered comfort during harvests, delivered food to widows and blankets to orphans, always at the exact moment they were needed, and never earlier or later than they should have been. And it was this sense of timing that unsettled some, as if the brothers always knew before something happened, not because of gossip or luck, but because the land told them, and the land told them everything. The people trusted them because the brothers gave them what they needed in times of crisis. They brought peace in times of hunger. They brought sustenance in times of death. They brought ritual and closure and a sense that nothing truly ended, only changed. And for people scraping a life from frozen dirt and distant laws, that was enough. The cemetery they established was not just a resting place. It became a point of orientation. Roads were marked by its boundary stones. Travelers used its chapel bell as a signal for distance, and some even claimed that their dreams led them there, whether they had lost someone or not. And in those dreams, the graves spoke not in words, but in vibrations that traveled up through the feet and into the spine and into the heart, and stayed there like a second pulse when the winter of 1789 brought a fever that took 12 children. In as many days the brothers worked night and day to comfort the family's build the coffins, dig the graves, and bless the bodies. But not one parent was allowed to witness the burial. Zechariah explained it was for sanitation, that the sickness must be sealed beneath earth before the cold set in, and the people believed him because grief dulls suspicion, and because no one else offered comfort like he did. But not one of those graves ever settled the way normal graves do. The soil remained loose for weeks. The stones sank unevenly. The trees around them wilted and then died, and those who visited the site too often began to hear voices soft and clear, and always from beneath their feet, begging, whispering, laughing, sometimes praying in tongues they did not recognize, but felt like lullabies sung wrong by mouths that had forgotten what sleep was. The Ashworth brothers explained nothing, but were always near when the fear rose too. High, always ready with a story or a warning or a silent presence that made people feel watched, but strangely safe. And it was that safety that allowed the operation to grow. From necessity to ritual, from ritual to industry, from industry to something else, entirely something older, something the brothers never named but referred to only once in a page, from a letter found decades later, hidden inside a false panel beneath the chapel floor. A letter from Ezekiel to Zechariah, written in 1791, which read, "Brother, the mouths beneath are restless, they whisper of a reckoning. They say the blood has slowed, and the weight of forgetting is not enough. We must act soon, or the ground will rise and take what it is owed." And beside the letter was a map, a crude spiral drawn around the center of the cemetery, with symbols that did not match any known language, and a single phrase scrawled in the margin, written in a hand not belonging to any of the brothers, and not resembling ink, but something darker, something that glimmered faintly. Even after all these years, the phrase read, "It will remember when you do not," and the page smelled faintly of iron and damp stone and ash. And now you must understand that Ashworth Creek was not chosen for its beauty or its location, or even its silence. It was chosen because the land beneath it was never meant to rest, because the land itself had a memory, and the brothers did not build their lives upon it. They awoke something that had only been sleeping and gave it names. gave it prayers, gave it bodies, and in return it gave them silence, wealth, reverence, and time to grow, time to refine, time to wait. And what it waits for is not resurrection, not justice, not even revenge. It waits for the return of what was stolen, not the bodies, not the bones, not the breath, but the recognition, the knowledge, the remembering. And that is what makes this story dangerous, because once you remember it, the land does too, and then it begins again. It began simply with a single body and a single question. Where does it go once the dirt is packed, once the weeping stops, once the names fade from the tongue? Like dust in a drought, Ezekiel had asked himself, that not as a mourner, not as a philosopher, but as a man who knew the price of flesh, the weight of bone, the elasticity of skin under pressure, he had asked it, while standing over the corpse of a man who had died of fever unnamed and unclaimed, a traveler whose boots were worn to the sole, whose teeth were broken at odd angles, whose coat pockets held nothing but a string of bones tied with red thread and a coin etched with markings. No currency had ever carried the fever, had eaten the man's face, but not his body, his organs intact, his muscles firm, the kind of corpse that fetch at a premium price in the places where medicine meant dissection and progress meant desecration. And so Ezekiel sent him, first packed in salt and linen, nailed into a crate, disguised as tools handed, off to a trader who never knew and never asked. And 2 weeks later, the payment arrived, not a letter, not a ledger, just a pouch of gold and a note that read, "Satisfactory condition, send more." And in that moment, something shifted, not in his heart, not in his conscience, but in his understanding, because now the dead were not burdens. They were inventory, and soon he saw them differently, not as neighbors or souls, but as specimens, as resources, as units of trade. And Zechariah agreed, not with words, but with silence and a single nod. And Marai began to adjust the size of the coffins, making the bottom shallower, the lids heavier, reinforcing the corners to hold the weight of stones instead of muscle and bone. And that was the first year. By the end of it, 8 bodies had been shipped. Not one noticed, not one questioned the families. Thanked them, cried over them, prayed above empty boxes filled with rocks and memories. And they never knew, never suspected. And even if they did, they said nothing, because in a place like Ashworth Creek, silence is safer than doubt, and doubt is punished. Not by men, but by the land itself. The ledgers began to change, not just the names, but the details, measurements, weight, muscle tone, cause of death, blood type. Injuries healed or fresh, each note more clinical, more detached, a language not of mourning, but of harvest. By 1786, requests began to arrive, not just for bodies, but for specific kinds: young males with long limbs, females with curved spines, children with oversized skulls, elderly men with lung damage. And the price varied not just by freshness, but by rarity, uniqueness. The ledgers refer to them as subjects, never names, never ages, just traits, numbers, conditions, and over time the entries grew colder lines like subject 6 healed femur, ideal for academic presentation, subject 11 extensive tooth decay, decline, request subject 22 requested for dual dissection, sent to Baltimore. And always that final phrase, coffin, weighted appropriately, family none. The wiser, always written with the same ink, same pressure, like a prayer, like a ritual, like a spell. And the brothers refined the process, step by step. First came preservation. Marai developed new methods using combinations of salt, alcohol, turpentine, and ash from a tree that only grew near the chapel, its bark black and pulsing with sap. Even in the dead of winter, the solution slowed decay, made the bodies firm but pliable, the scent masked with herbs burned in the cellar. Next came transportation. Harlan, the silent driver, took over, routing the crates through indirect paths, using old roads forgotten by the maps, sometimes traveling at night, sometimes waiting days in silence beneath tarpaulins while townsfolk passed unaware. And above all came the sermons. Zechariah preached louder, clearer, more beautifully than ever, weaving tales of resurrection and eternal rest while standing above graves that held only lies' graves, dug shallow and filled with rocks and frozen soil, and the people clung to his words, because when the world is, cruel comfort matters more than truth, and truth is sharp and slow and unwelcome when your hands are blistered and your children are dying. And the brothers knew this, and they used it not with hatred, not even with greed, but with purpose, because by then it was no longer about profit. The ledgers stopped listing prices around 1787, replaced by symbols, spirals, crosses, inverted numbers, letters that did not match any known alphabet, and in the margins, notes like requested by the hollow chair, confirmed by glass. L payment, rendered in kind, and the entries marked with red grew more frequent until they were the rule, not the exception. Bodies no longer waited to die, they were guided into death, carefully, quietly, with minimal trauma, no visible damage, no struggle, and Zachariah developed words for it, a liturgy of passing phrases he would whisper as the breath left the body, not in English, not in Latin, but in the tongue. He used in the woods alone phrases that left the ears ringing for days, and the witnesses, unable to speak of what they'd seen, the town never noticed, not because it was stupid or wicked, but because it had been conditioned, trained, lulled into a sleep, deeper than ignorance and colder than fear. Ezekiel wrote once that the greatest trick is not to hide a crime, but to teach people it is not a crime at all, just a transaction, just a passage, just a necessary part of something bigger. And that something bigger was never fully written, only hinted at in fragments, in dreams, in the drawings, found in the margins of Morai's journal, spines uncoiling, beneath the earth, circles of men around trees, with roots reaching into human skulls, diagrams of bodies posed in postures too perfect, too symmetrical, as if arranged for something that watches from angles we cannot perceive, and the crates kept going, the money stopped, but the work continued. The brothers no longer needed payment because the land itself paid them in peace, in power, and protection. The fever that struck other towns skipped Ashworth Creek. The crops grew longer into the frost. The wolves never came close. The children who survived grew tall and strong and clever, but never curious, not curious enough to ask why funerals were always closed caskets, why Zachariah's sermons always ended before dusk, why no one born in Ashworth Creek after 1790 ever left and came back, and the forest watched, and the chapel bell rang, and the crates moved east, and the spiral deepened, and even the birds stopped flying overhead, as if the sky itself refused to look down. And what the brothers built in those years, between 1784 and 1789, was not a business, not a crime, not even a conspiracy. It was a system, a belief and understanding that death is not sacred, that the body is not yours, and that knowledge, when harvested from flesh, becomes something more than knowledge. It becomes access. It becomes invocation. And that is why the spiral appears, again, again, carved beneath gravestones, etched into pews painted in blood, beneath the altar found on the underside of shipping crates, returned years later empty and warped and humming like metal, struck in just the right place to remember a sound that has not yet happened. And still the town slept, and still the families wept, and still the brothers worked quietly, perfectly, efficiently, because the greatest evil never shouts, it whispers, and what it whispered in the walls of Ashworth Creek could not be unlearned and once heard, could not be unheard and once remembered, would begin again. By the time the year turned to 1788, the ground had already changed beneath them, not just in feeling, not just in smell, but in texture, in taste, in the way it seemed to breathe underfoot like something buried, too long learning to inhale again. The cemetery expanded without ceremony. 2 more acres purchased from a man who left town that same night and never collected payment. His name was scratched from every record. Even his children refused to speak it, and the land he had owned became Ashworth. Land absorbed not through legal deed, but through the consent of silence, and no one questioned. The expansion because no one wanted to know the answer to the only question that mattered. Why so? Many graves for a town with so few dead, and still the funerals came quiet, closed, perfect little rituals, with weeping and singing and shovels and sermons and graves, filled not with flesh, but with weight, illusions crafted with precision. Morai had by now refined the interior architecture of the coffins so well that no one could tell the difference between stone and corpse, at least not without touching, and who in grief would dare disturb. What they were told was holy, and in the stillness of those ceremonies Zachariah stood taller than ever more. Serene more removed his voice, clearer now, more resonant, as if it no longer came from his lungs, but from the very wood of the chapel itself, vibrating through floorboards and pews and skin, until the mourners wept not for the dead, but for themselves. Unsure why unsure, when the sorrow had turned to something more primal, something closer to awe, the shipments increased the crates, changed shape thinner, now longer, narrower, as if designed for something not entirely human, the salt and herb formula, altered by Morai to include powdered bark from a tree that only grew in one corner of the cemetery, a tree that bled white sap and pulsed faintly beneath, its bark even when the wind was still, and Ezekiel stopped counting the bodies not because there were too many, but because numbers no longer mattered. What mattered was pattern. What mattered was ritual, and so the ledger became a diagram, more than a record, symbols and marks and spirals intersecting across pages, forming images when viewed. From a distance, maps of something deeper, something coiled. The requests from medical colleges grew stranger, asking for hearts from those who had died in fear, eyes from children born during eclipses, skulls with rare fractures, teeth blackened by unknown minerals, and no longer were they paid in money, but in pages torn from banned books, in relics stolen from burned monasteries, in preserved organs sealed in jars, marked with sigils that flared when touched and glowed faintly, even in total darkness. And still the townsfolk knew nothing, or claimed they knew nothing, though their eyes began to change slightly over time. A dullness behind the iris, a narrowing of focus, a disinterest in leaving or asking or remembering, and the animals vanished slowly, first the birds, then the foxes, then the deer, until the only living things that walked the woods were men, and even they walked differently, heads, low footsteps, soft, as if trying not to wake something buried. And it was around this time that the sounds began, not screams, not cries, but music, low, repetitive, discordant rhythms, heard only at night, always from beneath the chapel, never from within, and those who heard it too often began to change. First in sleep, restless limbs, teeth grinding, breath too fast, then in wakefulness, twitching fingers, eyes too wide, hunger too deep, dreams of spirals and roots and soil, packed over faces that still moved, and some began to speak words in languages they did not know, waking with blood in their mouths and dirt beneath their nails. And yet, when asked, they would smile and say they had slept well, that the town had never felt safer, that the brothers were a blessing, and maybe they were exactly what Ashworth Creek needed. Maybe they were exactly what the land had asked for, because not all hunger is evil, and not all evil is loud. Sometimes it is kind, sometimes it builds chapels and buries empty coffins and sings psalms while packing children into crates. And when the university officials visited, they saw nothing wrong. They saw cleanliness and precision, and they signed forms and shook hands and drank tea in a parlor where the air smelled faintly of copper, and where the eyes of Morai never blinked, and the hands of Ezekiel never stopped moving, and the smile of Zachariah never touched his eyes, and one of them left. A letter later found in his family home, sealed inside the frame of a painting. A letter that read, I shook hands with something hollow, and it was warm like breath, and beneath the floorboards something moved, and I think it knew my name, and then nothing else, because the man disappeared. 2 months later, and his children never spoke of him again. The preservation technique developed by Morai during this period became known in secret circles as the Ashworth process, and though never formally published, It was whispered among anatomists and grave robbers alike, a method so advanced it could preserve nerve tissue for weeks, keep flesh soft and supple, and keep the face so lifelike that one physician claimed he saw his specimen blink as he dissected its eye. The process used ingredients not available in any market herbs that grew only in the shadow of the Ashworth. Chapel minerals ground from stone pulled from graves that sank too deep to be exhumed, and water drawn from a well that had not seen light in decades, sealed with 7 locks carved with names that were not names but commands, and the brothers kept. No copies of the formula, only symbols burned into the underside of the work tables, and Marai's shop symbols that, when viewed in sequence, formed a shape that made no sense, and yet could not be forgotten once seen, because it looked back, and the shipments continued, each one accompanied by a note, not a manifest, not a price list, just a phrase. The silence deepens, or the spiral widens, or the breath remembers, and always the crates arrived at night, always unmarked, always damp as if sweating. Something unseen, and over time the requests changed again, now asking not for parts, not for samples, but for entire bodies, preserved, untouched, freshly dead, and preferably unbaptized. And still the chapel bell rang each Sunday, and still Zechariah preached, and still the town listened, because by now they were not a town but a congregation, and not a congregation of Christ, but of something older, something patient, something beneath. And when Marai built the new storage room beneath the undertaker's shop, the floor was made of stone from the cemetery itself, and in the center he placed a drain, not for blood, not for water, but for something that would come later, something that moved against gravity, something that called itself upward in silence. And when the room was done, he did not speak for 3 days, and when he returned, he was blind in one eye and never mentioned it. The spiral was now etched into every corner of the cemetery, into the grain of pews, into the folds of cloth wrapped around the dead, into the stones placed in coffins instead of flesh. And the people did not question, because their dreams were full, and their harvests were strong, and their children were healthy, though none of them remembered their birthdays, and some could not speak their names, and those who tried to leave found their horses lame, their wagons broken, their maps unreadable, as if the town itself had moved, as if Ashworth Creek was not in Kentucky anymore, not fully, not entirely. And this was the price, this was the agreement, this was the offering. And so the spiral widened, and the shipments continued, and the dead did not rest, and the living did not remember. And somewhere in the chapel beneath the altar something opened slowly, silently, patiently, something with too many eyes and not enough breath, something that had waited longer than language, and was still hungry, still waiting, still listening. The shift from opportunistic grave-robbing to calculated murder was never announced, never formalized, never written down, and yet it happened as surely as the seasons turned, as surely as the creek behind. The chapel darkened with every passing year. It began with a traveler, a man from Virginia whose name no one remembers, because it was never recorded, because he arrived alone, because he asked the wrong questions, because he looked too closely at the headstones and asked why they were all so new, so smooth, so precise, because he stayed too long in the chapel after the funeral and touched the altar without permission, and afterward he never spoke again. His mouth moved, but no sound came, and when he was found 2 days later walking barefoot in the woods, his feet were raw, and his tongue was gone, and his eyes were fixed on something no one else could see. And Zechariah said the fever had taken him, and the people believed it, because the truth would have torn them apart, because the truth was that the man had seen something beneath the chapel, something that had looked back, and when he was buried, the coffin was heavier than it should have been, and the dirt above his grave never settled properly. And that was the first and after. That the brothers no longer waited for death to arrive. They went looking for it, not in town, not among their neighbors, but beyond the borders and the woods, along the trade roads in the places where law faded and isolation bloomed. they learned to identify the ones no one would miss: drifters, vagrants, peddlers without permits, women who traveled alone, children who had no names, and when they could not find such people, they made them. They created absence. They cut the threads that connected lives. They forged letters, sent false messages, whispered lies into the ears of desperate people until they vanished into the soil, into the spiral, into the hollow beneath the altar. And Marai perfected the process of silent death, a blend of crushed poppy resin and nightshade mixed with the oils used in embalming, applied beneath the tongue or through a kiss or in a drink, and the victims died peacefully, their bodies intact, their flesh unspoiled, their souls stolen before they could rise. And the red crosses began to appear in the ledgers, small, at first hesitant, a mark of necessity, then more frequent, then systematic. By 1790, nearly two-thirds of the entries bore the cross, and the language changed: no longer subject deceased due to fever or fall, now subject rendered compliant, subject silenced without damage, subject accepted into the process. And the payments changed too, no longer from doctors, no longer from universities, now from names that did not belong to men or institutions, names written in characters that shimmered when exposed to fire, names that pulsed in the margins of the ledgers and made the ink smear and the parchment rot, and always the same phrase in the corner: the mouth beneath opens, and the accomplices multiplied, some drawn by money, others by knowledge, others still by something deeper, something more ancient, something they could not name, but felt in their bones, in their teeth, in their blood. Professors from Boston arrived and left without speaking. Physicians from Baltimore sent crates in return filled with tools, made of silver and bone and wrapped in cloth that screamed when burned a magistrate. From New York wrote that he would assist with legal protections in exchange for the body of a boy born blind under a red moon, and no one questioned their requests, because by then the network had grown wide and deep, a lattice of silence and sacrifice, stretching across the colonies, binding together men of science and faith and law into a single purpose, a single hunger. And the spiral widened, and the chapel pulsed, and the town forgot, not all at once, not in some sudden stupor, but gradually, subtly. Names faded, dates blurred, memories twisted, until no one could quite remember who had been buried where or when or why. And still the funerals continued, and still the sermons flowed, and still the crates departed at night. And no one noticed that the graves were shallow, or that the soil smelled of iron, or that the trees leaned inward toward the chapel, like worshippers in a cathedral built for something, without eyes, without voice, without form. And those who tried to remember found their dreams twisted, found their thoughts heavy, found their mouths filled with soil and silence. And still the brothers worked. Zachariah's sermons now included references to books, never written, quoting texts. No one could source lines that made the skin crawl and the mind rebel, and yet the congregation wept and clapped and sang, louder than ever, their eyes glassy, their voices hollow, their faith unbreakable. Because it was no longer faith, it was submission. And Ezekiel kept the ledgers, but also something else, a second book, leather-bound and sealed with a clasp made from the jawbone of a deer. Inside were not names or numbers, but descriptions of movements, of rituals, of breath control and posture, diagrams of the body bent in impossible ways, arrows showing the flow of blood toward the heart and away from the soul, symbols that when traced with the finger made the air colder, that when read aloud made the ears ring and the mouth bleed. And Marai carved new tools, thin blades with no handles, needles made of glass tubes designed not to extract but to inscribe. And each victim became not just a body, but a vessel, a scroll, a canvas for knowledge, not meant for man. And some of them moved long after death, their mouths forming shapes that meant nothing and everything, their fingers twitching in rhythm with the chapel bell. And still the brothers continued, and the red crosses filled the pages, and the people of Ashworth Creek became something else, not alive, not dead, but suspended, somewhere in between their hearts beating, but their memories fogged, their eyes clear, but their wills dimmed, and no one left, and no one arrived, and the town became a closed circle, a perfect spiral, and the thing beneath the chapel breathed and stretched and dreamed and waited. And when the fever came again, and took 15 in a week, the brothers did not panic. They selected, preserved, shipped, and the fever stopped, and no one questioned the exchange, because the land had spoken, and the price had been paid, and the cycle was complete, and the hollow was full, and the crates returned empty but warm. And when they were opened, each one contained a letter written in ash, folded into the shape of an eye, and the letters read in unison, "We remember," and the spiral widened, and the hunger deepened, and the red crosses multiplied, and the dead no longer slept, they waited. Elizabeth Caldwell was not the kind of woman to ask questions. She had been born in the valley. She had married at 17. She had buried 2 children before they could speak, and she had never once left Ashworth Creek. Her world was the chapel, the hearth, the pine-shadowed path to the well, her life measured in laundry lines and hymns, and the soft whisper of dirt over wood when the preacher said the final words, and the shovel did the rest. But when her husband Thomas died in the autumn of 1821, something changed, not in the way he died, which was sudden but acceptable, a fall from the barn roof, a broken neck. Nothing to stir suspicion, but in what came after the weight of his coffin was wrong. She noticed it when the pallbearer struggled to keep balance, not from straying, but from surprise, from the ease with which the box moved, as if it carried nothing at all, as if it was not a coffin but a decoy. And when she placed her hand on the lid during the service, she felt no presence beneath. No breath, no memory, no echo, only cold, flat emptiness, like touching a lie. She tried to dismiss it, tried to believe it. Was grief twisting her senses, tried to pray it away, but the feeling stayed, and 2 nights later she returned to the cemetery. Alone, the moon was low, and the fog sat on the graves like a second skin, and the chapel windows were dark, but something inside still glowed faintly, a rhythm like breath, a pulse like memory. And when she reached the grave, she found the earth was still loose, still unsettled, like it had not been pressed down by time or sorrow, like it had been packed only to fool the eye. And the sound that came from beneath was not her husband's voice, not exactly, but something shaped like it, something wearing his words wrong, sighs wrong cadence. And she stepped back as she knew something terrible and final and irreversible had happened. She knew she had buried nothing, and that her husband had not been taken by accident, and she began to ask questions. Not aloud, not to the townsfolk who smiled too easily and blinked too little, but in her mind, in her journals, in her prayers. She began to trace the names of others who had died recently, who had died strangely, who had disappeared into the spiral of grief without returning. And she found patterns. She found that the funerals were always at dusk, that the coffins were never opened, that the brothers never wept, and that the chapel never locked. And she returned to the cemetery again and again, always alone, always in silence. And one night she broke into the undertaker's house, found the cellar, found the sawdust, the crates stacked and labeled, not with names, but numbers and dates and symbols that made her eyes water and her teeth ache. And in one crate she found a boy she had taught to read 2 summers earlier, his eyes open, his mouth sewn shut, his chest marked with lines she could not understand. And in another she found a woman who had died of fever only weeks ago, now preserved, now packed, now ready for shipping. As she ran, she screamed into the darkness, and the town did not stir, the dogs did not bark, and the chapel bell did not ring, but someone heard her, because the next morning Zachariah arrived at her home with bread and tea and eyes that never blinked, and he said, "Sister Elizabeth, your grief weighs heavy. May I pray with you?" And she smiled and let him in and locked the door behind him. And when she emerged 3 hours later, her hands were clean, her eyes were clear, and she walked directly to the sheriff's office and told him. Everything not with hysteria, not with confusion, but with a clarity. That came from knowing that silence was death, that questions were the only weapon the town had. Left, and the sheriff listened, and he did not interrupt, and when she finished, he said nothing, just nodded once and left. And that night the chapel did not light its lanterns, and the brothers did not appear, and the cemetery was silent, and the wind did not blow, and by dawn the brothers were gone. No trace, no footprints, no fire, no blood. Just absence, their home empty, their books. Missing, their tools gone, as if they had evaporated, as if the land itself had swallowed them, and beneath the chapel the altar was cracked, as if something had pushed up from below and stopped, and the townsfolk did not speak of it. They avoided the cemetery. They avoided each other. They avoided the questions that Elizabeth had spoken aloud, because now they had. In spoken, they could not be unheard, and what followed was not justice, not revenge, but stillness, a stillness so profound that the birds returned for the first time in years, and the deer stepped back into the woods, and the children cried for reasons they could not name, and the graves began to collapse one by one, as if rejecting the soil, as if coughing up lies. And one morning the chapel door swung open without cause, and a low sound came from within. Not music, not voice, but a humming. So deep it bent the trees and shook the roots, and then silence again, as if whatever had been left behind had finally gone to sleep, and Elizabeth vanished. 3 days later, not taken, not murdered, just gone, her house undisturbed, her fire still warm. Her boots by the door, and in her place a note carved into the wood of the table with a blade that had never been found, and the note read, "The spiral never ends, it only deepens," and the people of Ashworth Creek did not argue, and they did not search, because they knew that the price had not yet been paid in full, and that what had been uncovered in that cellar was not the worst of it, not the center, not the source, just the edge of something older, something wider, something waiting. And though the brothers were never found, and no court ever heard their names, the land remembered, the graves remembered, the spiral remembered, and when the fog returned, and the wind shifted, and the soil grew warm, again beneath bare feet, those who had survived knew that the question was never what had happened. The question was when it would happen again, and whether this time the earth would even bother to pretend to cover its dead. The question that came after the silence was not how, but why. Why so many bodies? Why so much secrecy? Why so many men of learning willing to pay for blood, with ink, with whispers, with silence? And the answer was written not in the ledgers that remained, not in the symbols that rotted the pages, but in the hunger of the institutions that called themselves civil, that wore robes of progress, and draped their ambitions in the language of science and discovery, the truth. Was that America's finest? Medical schools were built on a foundation of stolen flesh, that the rise of anatomy as a discipline was not the result of noble curiosity, but of calculated desecration, and that from Philadelphia to Boston to Baltimore men with clean hands and polished shoes passed laws to restrict cadaver access, while privately commissioning agents to fill their tables with fresh specimens, no matter the cost or the origin. And the Ashworth brothers were only one node in a vast web, a network of cold trade routes and unmarked crates and coded letters, and beneath every dissection theater lay a trail of lies and vanished lives. And what made the brothers different, what made them unforgettable, was not that they trafficked in the dead, but that they learned to make the dead, to cultivate them like a crop, to harvest silence, to plant deception, to nurture the ritual of disappearance, until it became a culture, until it became invisible, and the doctors looked the other way, because what they saw on the slab was not a man or a child or a soul, but a subject, a specimen, a tool for knowledge. And the knowledge grew, and the universities expanded, and the spiral widened, and nothing stopped, because nothing wanted to. And when the first official report was compiled in 1832, it made no mention of the brothers, only noted a troubling pattern of missing persons in eastern Kentucky and recommended. Increased surveillance of frontier towns, and the report was sealed classified under the authority of a senator whose name appeared in Zechariah's final ledger scrawled beside a symbol resembling a key inside a throat, and that senator would later become a founding trustee of a prestigious medical college whose alumni would dissect there. Way through generations of progress, never asking, never pausing, never doubting the origins of the bodies that taught them the arteries, the nerves, the secrets of the human form, and no memorial was ever built for the lost, no plaque ever placed at Ashworth Creek, which by 1850 had been renamed Devon Hollow, and by 1870 had vanished entirely from maps, absorbed into the forest, its foundations cracked by roots, its gravestones swallowed by moss, and the chapel burned in 1881 by a man who claimed to see something move in its walls, something that whispered in Latin and knew his father's sins, and he burned it with salt and oil and fire. And still the earth smoked for 3 days, and still the smell never left the soil, and no crops ever grew on that land again, and those who passed too close reported dreams of coffins filled with breathless children and sermons that never ended, and men with open mouths standing in graves and smiling, and the ledgers that remained, the 17 books unearthed in 1918, were quickly removed from public record, absorbed into private collections, sold at auction to silent bidders, shipped overseas, and only fragments remain now, charred pages smuggled into libraries under false named symbols, misfiled as folk art diagrams mistaken for alchemical nonsense. And yet those who find them, those who read even a sentence, report the same effect: a heaviness, a ringing in the ears, the taste of iron, the sudden knowledge of having been watched since birth, and some of them go missing. And some of them forget their names, and one burned himself in a chapel, claiming he had seen the face of God beneath the skin of a preserved boy, and that it was smiling, and that it wanted to be remembered. And so the story remains buried, not erased, just pressed deeper like a seed, waiting for warmth, waiting for light, waiting for silence to rot into curiosity, and curiosity into obsession, and obsession into sacrifice. And though the Ashworth brothers are gone, and their names are not taught, and their crimes are not judged, the trade they perfected continues quietly beneath the clean white walls of institutions that still need bodies, still need silence, still need men to forget that the cost of knowledge was never paid in coin. And if you find yourself walking past a medical college late at night, and the lights are still on, and the air smells like salt and dust and something not quite dead, listen closely, and you might hear the spiral calling, still deepening, still feeding, still waiting for your name to be added to the ledger, still waiting for you to kneel before the altar and ask, what am I worth? What would you trade to be remembered? What would you give to know what lies beneath? And would you lie still? Would you lie silent? Would you lie whole?